Good evening. It is 6:30, April the 5th. We are doing the class on Job. I am doing it from home. We have had some major storms go through the area this afternoon and earlier the day. And it was my understanding that we might be getting some more later this afternoon. I also know that there are those down in the southern part of the state that are going under some situations where there's going to be, and some of them might have been wanting to travel up here. So we decided just to try to have everybody stay home, hunker down. And we are doing this class tonight from home online. And thus we begin. Secondly, as I begin into this, I mentioned the fact in our email and so forth that we would pick up with Job chapter 26, beginning in verse 5. And my idea is just kind of go over some things that we had talked about, remind ourselves a little bit about what's going on there. The thing that we find beginning back in Job, actually beginning in Job chapter 22 or 23, Job then begins to give some answers to Eliphaz, 23 and 24. Bildad has a very quick, short statement he makes in verses 1 through 6 of chapter 25. And then chapter 26 through chapter 31, we have Job's response before Elihu. Another person comes in and gives his 2 cents worth. And as we ended up talking about last week, we briefly mentioned some ideas that just shows us how great our God is. I'm grateful for the fact that God is great, that he is in control. And I think this is one of the things and part of the reasons why this particular book was written and why we need to be studying it. Whenever our lives collapse, when everything that can go wrong will go wrong, when we are struggling with decisions made and struggling with things that are just totally out of our control, what do? Do we blame God and turn our backs on him? No. We should grow in faith, try to learn what he's trying to emphasize to us, and grow thereby. And so chapter 26 is one of those great passages in this book that emphasizes the glory of God. And as Bildad had made some points very quickly, Job is now defending God. In the book Life on the Ash Heap by Jim McGuigan, where he briefly talks about Job and God. It's a very short book if you want to buy it and read it. He makes some very, very great points in that book. But one of the things that he emphasized in the book was the idea that God portrayed Job as being his greatest defender, that Job had not sinned, and that people, when they go through the worst times in their lives, can still believe, keep the faith, trust God, and know that everything's going to work out. And I think that's what he does here. As he looks at this, he emphasized, and I'm just touching on this, trying to get us back into what's going on here. Sheol, or the grave, is naked before him. Destruction has no covering. He stretches out the north over the empty space, hangs the earth on nothing. I talked very briefly, quickly about how the clouds that just came through this afternoon carry all this water and how they're able to dump that much water on the ground. And it amazes us, and we're surprised and we're shocked. And again, there's scientists that have studied the reasons why and so forth. But again, it's amazing whenever you begin to think about how much was going on there. He emphasizes he stirs up the sea with his power, and by his understanding, he breaks up the storm. He puts the storms on the earth, but he also breaks the storms up. And he emphasizes the idea, these are the mere edges of his ways, and how small a whisper we hear of him. Sometimes God did speak in a still small voice, but God also speaks through the thunder. He speaks through his power. The fact that we're still here just continues to emphasize to me and to every devout Christian, God is still in charge. We need those reminders. And so as Job deals with his own frailty, but he also deals with God's majesty, let us understand that as he's struggling, as he's trying to keep the faith, despite what his friends have been doing and accusing him of everything they could to try to sit back and justify their idea that Job deserved what he got. He knows, Job knows that the one that he can trust more than anything else is God. And I just pray that we all, that every last one of us would understand that very same thing. Now we go on in chapter 27, verse 1. And this chapter divides itself into three major sections. Number one, he still maintains his integrity, and he makes the point that I'm going to hold on to this integrity as long as he lives. Chapter 27, verses 4 through 6. As we go on a little further, he emphasizes the idea of verses 7 through 10 that he is cursing as it was his enemies. And then in the third section, he returns to the consideration of God's treatment of the wicked. And I think he goes back and retracts the view that he had maintained in Job chapter 24, verses 2 through 24, where he emphasizes the idea that God doesn't pay attention to the adulterer, the murderer, the rebel, the dying, and so forth. And that he emphasizes in uncertain terms, you know what? They're all equal, righteous or not, they're all equal in death. And so I guess what he's trying to do here is make a retraction of what he said earlier in Job chapter 24, verse 2 through 24, but again, trying to deal with his feelings, his emotions, his struggles, trying to work through in his own mind why God allowed this to happen. Even though Job was righteous. We all have a sense in our mind that God, being a just God, a loving God, that he has to punish sins. And we can sit back and nod our heads and say, yeah, you're right. We deserve some punishment for some of the sins that we do. But whenever we look and can't figure out what we've done, when we can't really come up with any explanation for what we're going through, and when we consider that God is good, and then ask the reason why he allows Satan to do things like this he did to Job. And in a sense, think about it in this respect, by allowing Satan to do this to Job, questions God's righteousness. I think as I continue to struggle with this, as I read through Job and try to understand, I think sometimes about bad things in my life that have happened and the fact that I have deserved them. But I also think about the idea that there are many, many times when God has not necessarily let me off, never, 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 but instead he has brought about the punishment because of the wickedness that I've done, or allowed me to go through what I was going through in that respect. So as you look at this, he's still struggling with this. As we continue to study this, excuse me, as we continue to study this, let's continue to struggle. And let's continue as we struggle to find out what's going on here. In chapter 27, verse 1, moreover, Job continued his discourse, his parable, okay? He's using this to talk about the idea that all these other things that's going on. He wants this idea in here in chapter 27, verse 1, but he also continues, the Bible says in chapter 29, verse 1, he further continued his discourse. So this continues to be a long discourse. It's probably the longest one that we see him have. So he says, as God lives, who's taken away my judgment. Now, up to this point in time, he hasn't really blamed God for it seems like anything. But now he says, as God lives, This was an oath that they a lot of times would make whenever they're talking about God. They made this oath a lot of times. In Judges 8, verse 19, where it says, as the Lord lives, if you were saved from alive, I would not kill you. Ruth 3:13, 1 Samuel 14 at verse 39, 1 Samuel 20, verse 3, so forth. The bottom line is that the one who God to whom Job is appealing to, God, has taken away or withheld his judgments. In other words, he's talked about this already in Job chapter 9 and Job 13. And that's the idea that, God is just, but I'm afraid to get into a controversy with him as to the justice of his doing. And so he says, the Almighty who has made my soul bitter. Again, even though Job 13:15 says, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. Again, he will say in chapter 19 that God is his witness, his helper, his redeemer. So he's struggling. All right, if God is my helper, redeemer, the one I'm going to continue to trust in no matter what, then why am I going through this? As long as my breath is in me and the breath of God in my nostrils, my lips will not speak wickedness, nor my tongue utter deceit. He says, far be it from me that I should say you are right. Till I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. My righteousness I hold fast, and I will not let it go. My heart shall not reproach me as long as I live. Even in the midst of all the suffering, Job will not speak words of wickedness. He's not going to speak wicked words. He's not going to cuss everything out. How often do we live in a world and a culture today when things don't go the way people think they ought to? How often do we find a lot of people cursing, and maybe that might give them some quote relief, unquote, but does that really help anything? No. Neither will he. Job's not going to say any wicked words, but he's also not going to utter untruth. His friends have been saying all along that he's guilty of some sin, and what Job needed to do was confess that guilt, so that if he would confess that guilt, then God would bless him again. And Job is saying, I've not done anything wrong. So if he made a confession that his friends have asked him to do, he would be lying. He said, I can't do that either. So you see, he kind of caught it a rock and a hard place. And again, he hears what they're saying and understands what they're saying, but he said, I'm not going to speak wickedness. I'm not going to lie about my situation. He says, far be it from me to say that you are right. God forbid that I justify you. In other words, saying that and again, the question is, he says, far be it from me that I should say you are right. Now, is he talking to his friends here? May very well be the case. Is he talking to God here? Perhaps. We need to be very careful that as he speaks to them in this manner, as he's talking to them that are sitting there, he said, I'm not going to remove my integrity from me. I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to try to confess something that I haven't done, so that you could sit back and be justified, you friends of mine, saying that I've sinned and in some way or another deserve exactly what I've got. Again, go back to Job chapter 22, verse 5 through 9. They ask the question, is not your evil abundant? There's no end to your iniquities. You have exacted pledges of your brothers for nothing, stripped the naked of their clothing. You've given no water to the weary to drink, and you have withheld bread from the hungry. The man with power possessed the land, and the favored man lived in it. You sent widows away empty, and the arms of the fatherless were crushed. You see, these were some of the accusations they were making against Job, and Job saying, no, no, no. Verse 6, my righteousness I hold fast, and I will not let it go. He did not give up his integrity in the past. He's going to hold on to that blameless life now. He's not going to curse God and die. And again, he will maintain his faith in God and his dependence on God. Remember again that passage that I think is so important, Job 13:15, and that might be on a test. Quote Job 13:15, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. Job goes on and says, my heart shall not reproach me as long as I live. In other words, I know that I've not done anything wrong. He would say that I have a conscience that is void of offense toward God and toward man. And again, think about Acts chapter 24, verse 16. So there he says, I've always taken pain to have a good conscience before God and man. Acts 23, Paul would say to the friends, he said, brothers, I've lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. And again, in 1 Corinthians 4, I'm not aware of anything against myself. I'm thereby acquitted. It's the Lord who judges me. So you see, Job and Paul kind of sits the understanding there, and Paul saying, I've lived my life, even before I became a Christian, I've lived my life the way I'm firmly convinced that I needed to live it, and I thought I was doing what was right. But he also knew that he had sinned and had killed many of his brothers and sisters in Christ because of what he had done. And so it's something to think about and meditate on very, very much. So again, can we all say that we've lived in all good conscience before God to this day? What is the conscience? How does that prick our conscience? How does that go on? And again, we go into a lot of discussion as to the conscience is something that we train by our knowledge of God's word and God's will. So how important is it that we make sure that we hold on to our integrity, to our conscience, to do what's right? It's vital. It is vital. So it goes on. He said, may my enemy be like the wicked. In other words, what he's going on, he's emphasizing the idea, you try to persuade me to act wickedly by making a false confession of my feelings and convictions. I refuse to do so. Let that rather be the act of my enemy. In other words, my enemy may be like the wicked. They may make accusations against me. And think about, that's exactly what his friends had been doing. They had been making accusations against me. So he who rises up against me is like the unrighteous. Gentlemen, you are the ones that are unrighteous. You are the ones that need to repent. And so now, as he's looking at it, his friend are now his enemies. And he's saying, in essence, here it is. He that rises up against me is as the unrighteous. So those of you that have said these things against me, you are the ones that are unrighteous. And he's making that very clear as he goes on through here. What is the hope of the hypocrite? He says, though he may gain much if God takes away his life. Here again, this hypocrite may gain a lot here on this earth by being hypocritical. But what's he going to gain when he dies? Again, the hypocrite and the liar will take advantage of people in this life by their lies, by their hypocrisy, by their deceit, by their deceiving men, by raising himself up into his opinion. And again, he's emphasizing the idea, God is going to take away his soul. And it also suggests the idea that God's judgment is taking his soul. So think about here again, it might be a very small, yet very vivid idea, bringing out the fact that we all are hypocritical at times, but also that that there's something beyond this life. What will it profit a man if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul? So verse 9, he said, my enemy be like the wicked, again, talking about his friends. He says, what is the hope of the hypocrite that he may gain if God takes away his life? Will God hear his cry when trouble comes upon him? Will he give him relief? No, if you cut yourself off from God, if you live a lie and you sever yourself from your maker, you can make all the prayers for help vain. And again, God is not going to necessarily come to your aid. He says, will he delight himself in the Almighty? Will he always call on God? Again, does the hypocrite really delight in the Almighty? Or does he shrink from him and does not like the thought of his presence? We may fool people, but we cannot fool God. And as Job is talking here, he says, I'm not going to do what you've asked me to do because I'm not going to be the hypocrite. I'm not going to give myself up to the worldliness of this world just to make you guys happy and to justify your erroneous thoughts about where I am and what I'm doing. Oh, beloved, what great lesson there's for us. So he asked the question, will he always call on God? So again, think about the idea that when I refuse to pray, whenever I refuse to repent, when I refuse to do these different things, there's a barrier between the hypocrite and the Almighty. And again, the thing is that we've got to remember that usually hypocrites will eventually stop praying. Hypocrites will eventually stop doing what God wants them to do. Or if they do continue to pray, if they do continue to come to church, if they do continue to do these things, they do it not because of their love for the Lord, but because they just want to go through the motions. The word hypocrite in the English is a translation of hypokrites, which means to act the part. So Job's saying, I'm not going to do that. I refuse to do that because I know where I stand with God. So he says, will the hypocrite really always call on God? And as Job has gone through this book, as we've read these things, he prayed to God, he talked to God, but he's not going to play the hypocrite. What a great lesson. Now, we come up to chapter 27, verse 11. I will teach you about the hand of God. What is with the Almighty, I will not conceal. Surely all of you have seen it. Why then do you behave with complete nonsense? And so as you look at this, you see that he's really trying to emphasize to all of them, I'm going to teach you about God. I'm going to help you to understand this about God. And he said, I want you to understand these things. What I know about the Almighty, I will not conceal. And I know that God is a God that hates hypocrisy. And I'm not going to do what you've asked me to do. All of you have seen it. Why then do you behave with, as the New King James says, why are you behaving with complete nonsense? You know, the thing is you're struggling with me, so I'm going to teach you. I'm going to deliver these real sentiments. I'm going to tell you how I really feel about God's dealings with men in the world. And you kind of have an introduction here to what he's about to say. So verses 11 and 12 kind of introduces the rest of what he has to say. And he's going to give a discourse on wisdom, how we get it, how we should live by it in chapter 28. In chapter 29, he's going to give his defense. So picture again a court of law and him giving his defense there. And as he continues to go through this in chapter 30 and 31, we're going to see him. This is what it's all going to boil down to. He's going to teach them what they need to know about God. So he says, what? God knows all these things. You know what I've been saying. So he says, that which is with the Almighty, I will not conceal. I trust God to do what's right. I trust God to vindicate me eventually, even though I still struggle with the idea of why I'm having to go through this to begin with. And I'm going to teach you some things about God that you need to be reminded of. So let's really pay attention to this. And then he asked the idea, I'm not going to speak with complete nonsense. Why are you speaking in vain, as it was? You've seen it. You've seen the divine scheme of action. And again, you've seen it in the sight of men. So in essence, the first point that he tries to make is you've seen how God is. You've seen how hypocrites are. You've seen how hypocrites put on shows before God. You're blaming and charging me with this, but I refuse to be a hypocrite and to confess to something that I have not done. So he's saying, in essence, what kind of inferences are you seeing or emphasizing here? You've seen it. So why are you behaving with this nonsense? Why don't you draw the true facts, the true inferences as you're looking at it? You have to realize I haven't sinned. And I will continue to emphasize that I have not sinned. And I'm not going to sin by confessing to something I've not done. So this is the portion of a wicked man with God and the heritage of oppressors received with the Almighty. So what does he see? What is he going to say? I'm going to lay it down. I'm going to emphasize to you what exactly it brings up to. And in a sense, he brings up the words of Zophar in Job 20:29, where Job said, this is the wicked man's portion from God, the heritage decreed for him by God. So he says, retribution to the wicked is their portion, their heritage, the natural result of their sin. I want you to know that I agree with that 100%, that God will punish those who sin. But in my case, this is not what has happened, for I have not sinned to deserve what I'm in right now. He says, if his children be multiplied, it's for the sword. Again, one of the things that Job says about the wicked man, and he had emphasized this idea, is that a lot of the wicked men have offspring that are established in their presence, and their descendants are before their eyes. Job 21, verse 8. Now think again about the idea that Job's family, Job's children, Job's sons, daughters died. And they make the point there that your children will die because of your wickedness. And he says, no, the wicked have offspring. They're established. They're descendants before their eyes. And a lot of times they will grow up to do what? Be just like their daddy, like their mama. Job 21, verse 11, they send out their little boys like a flock. Their children dance. The wicked people are enjoying all of these blessings. And I've already referenced that. So you're saying, if that's the case, if it's for the sword, he says, their offspring shall not be satisfied with bread. The idea then, those who take the sword, either in their persons or in their prosperity, will perish with the sword. So he still believes that they that take the sword will perish with the sword. But on the flip side, it doesn't always happen immediately. It doesn't always happen that way. But also think about the idea. He said his offspring shall not be satisfied with bread. If they escape the sword, then they may have to struggle because of their parents' wickedness, clinging to them. When we read this a lot of times, again, we think about the doctrine of inherited sin, and we think about the idea that we inherit our father's sins, and that's not the case. That's not the case. Whenever I'm going to be judged on the day of judgment, I'm going to be judged for what I have done, not what my father or grandfather or great-grandfather did. I'm going to be judged by what I've done. And so it's important that we think about what Job is trying to emphasize here. He said, I know if his children are multiplied, his offspring shall not be satisfied with bread. And it seems like Job agrees with them in that respect. Look in verse 15. Those who survive him shall be buried in death. Their widows shall not weep. The idea of this is that they shall die and be forgotten, and their widows shall not weep. They've been through a lot. they've struggled with a lot. And again, think about the idea that a lot of times whenever you're going through so many things, you just can't weep anymore because you have no more tears left. So they shall be buried in death. They shall be lamented. And even, they should even go beyond that in that respect. Job 27:16. Though he heaps up silver like dust and piles up clothing like clay. He may pile it up, but the just will wear it, and the innocent will divide the silver. So again, Zechariah chapter 9, verse 3 emphasizes that the children of Israel are the city of Tyre. Zechariah heaped up silver as the dust in vast quantities. The wicked man might heap up silver in the same respect. And he might prepare raiment, his clothing, with rich dresses, robes of honor to be given to friends and companions. And again, many Eastern monarchs still have robes of honor and presented as mark of favor to visitors and important. Verse 17, he may pile it up, but the just will wear it, and the innocent will divide the silver. So he says they can have all these clothes, all this silver, but what? The innocent shall divide it. So this is kind of, again, a reversal of parallelism, synthetic and antithetic parallelism, where the innocent shall divide the silver and so forth. What does he do? This man, this wicked man, Job will say, and what is he doing here? He's telling them, I agree with you about the wicked, but it doesn't fit my case. I want you to understand what's going on and not make assumptions and so forth that just automatically assume that I have sinned in this horrible way. I don't want you to do that. I want you to understand that I agree with you, but it doesn't fit my case. 27:18, he builds his house like a moth. The wicked man builds his house. Think about moths. They're very fragile creatures, moths do not construct dwellings for themselves. And so some people have suggested the idea that maybe they're talking more about a spider web rather than a moth, or something along that line. Think about the idea that you've seen maybe some moths come out of their cocoons. So he says, these rich men will build his house like a moth, the muth, which a watchman makes. And the idea is these huts, these lodges, they're not designed to live in all the time. They're just there to stay, maybe to get some out of the heat for just a little while, out away from the sun's glare. Also, maybe at those times you would go up there and buy from these huts, these booths, whatever goods you want, whatever crops you want, the vineyards, the orchards, or whatever. And these habitations are the weakest kind. And that's what he's saying. He says the wicked don't have houses that are definitely firm. Now, I want you to stop for just a moment and think about this. Think about even our own culture, how so many of those that are rich in this world and rich in this world's goods have these huge mansions. And it seems like that they have these lustrous parties and so forth and so on, and all these gates and all these security trying to take care of them and bless them and so forth. And a lot of times these are very wicked people. And that just kind of goes back to make the argument that Job has been trying to make all along. I agree with you that the wicked will be punished, but that's all left up to the mind and heart of God, not if, but when it's going to happen. And I think, again, how important it is to realize that that's the way it is. Going on to verse 19, the rich man will lie down, but not be gathered up. In other words, the idea is that, he will lay down rich, but whenever he wakes up, he may be poor. His wealth shall not be gathered again and again. It may alter and translate, he lies down rich, but he shall do so no more. So there's a lot of different ways they've translated this Hebrew phrase here as you look at it. He opens his eyes and he is not. All right. One moment, the rich man could be very rich, enjoying all these blessings, and the next moment, especially in an agricultural land, that blight or storms or things that we are associated with could wipe a man out just that quickly. So again, and then what happens? Well, when the man has nothing else, then what? He finds himself in the hand of murderers because they're wanting to take what they've got, because it's not only affected the rich man, but it's affected everybody. And then people began to terrorize him. Sometimes some of these rich people are richly blessed and they have no problem. Sometimes they do suffer because of their sins. Verse 20, terrors overtake him like a flood. Again, think over the ideal of the flood of waters coming over. I grew up in Alabama, and we had a creek on our property that we had, and many times I saw floods, and we always had to make sure that the animals were up to where they wouldn't be washed away as it was in the flood on these creeks and so forth. So the thing is that it can destroy property, it can destroy crops, it can destroy people. Think about the idea of dams bursting and people in the path of the dam bursting. We understand that be swept away. A lot of rich people are always worried about losing everything they've got. And what will they do next? And how will they be able to live next? So at one moment they're fine, everything's going good. But maybe he might fear the vengeance of those who he has oppressed to get his money. He may feel worried about the loss of his prosperity at any moment. He may be brought to the fact that he is going to have to answer to God for what he has done. And again, all of this rushes upon him in one heart, and it steals him away in the night. It just takes him away. The storm just goes, and he's gone. Job is saying, I see you. I understand that. I agree with you. That's the way it is with wicked men. I agree. But I'm not that guy. All that's happened to me, in a sense. Lost children, lost wealth, lost all these things. The dams burst. I've seen everything wash away. My health is gone. But I know that it's not because of some sin in my life. The east wind comes and takes him away. He says, and he's gone. It sweeps him out of his place. It hurls against him and does not spare. And again, so it's the idea of he flees desperately from its power. And men will clap their hands because the wicked man is gone. And he shall hiss him out of his place. So as you keep studying and thinking about what he's trying to say here, yes, Job is saying, I understand. I know that this is the way it is with the wicked. Now think about it, as you go through everything that we've just studied, think about the ideal of his family being gone. That, again, his sons and daughters multiply, but it's not because they have been blessed from heaven, but it's because they've had everything they need. They have violence come in. A lot of times they don't die peacefully, but they have to live long lives that suffer. They're humiliated. You think about this wealth, his money shall be gone. And just like that, his clothing, to the Orientals, to the people of that place and time, clothing had a very important aspect. It was an important thing that they needed to understand. His palace could be gone. And then the wicked man himself could die, again, by sudden death. How often, the rich fool, how often do we think about what the Bible says, where the fool would sit back and say, take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry, because I've got everything I need. And that night, his soul was required of him. Think about their thinking of judgment. And they should have been helping others again, but they weren't. And so they're going to be faced by God, and God's going to face them and give them judgment. And so through all of this, what he's trying to emphasize is that each one of us have a certain place and a certain role to fill, that we are to fulfill that role to the best of our ability, that we don't need to be thinking like the world, that a rich man is to be absolutely blessed, obviously. Sometimes he might be, as in Job's case. Sometimes it may not have anything to do with that. Think about the idea that when the rich man dies, maybe a time of joy for some people. Think about how sometimes the death of a saint brings us to something more. So this particular passage is emphasized to us in chapter 27, the whole idea of what he's trying to get across, but he says not everything fits into your ideas. So he goes on in chapter 28. Surely there's a mine for silver, a place where gold is refined, iron is taken from the earth, copper is smelted from ore. Man puts it into darkness, searches every recess, and ore in the darkness and the shadow of death. Now, this passage, as you begin to read it, you're sitting there scratching your head. Well, what is this? What is he talking about? It seems like all of a sudden, after talking about the wicked and their state and how they would be punished, he now just seems to seemingly just totally go off task here. But what the writer's trying to do now is emphasize the idea in all of this is that through everything that we live, we gain wisdom. And this is what he's trying to emphasize here in chapter 28, the importance of wisdom. Now, and he starts off, as it was, by talking about digging for silver or digging for gold. All right. You go back and you start reading some of this. I recently, just for the first time in my life, ever watched the movie The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, where Humphrey Bogart was in playing the role of a miner looking for gold. They found gold. And what began to happen, especially with Humphrey Bogart's character, is the fact that he then became so paranoid because he had his gold that he was then didn't even trust his friends that helped him to gain the gold that he had. And he was looking over his shoulder all the time. He had no joy, because what he was more worried about is he was obsessed with the gold that he had. There was no joy in his life. He was a rich man, yes. He had gold, yes. But at the very last scene of the movie, the bags get tore open, literally. A Sirocco comes in and blows the gold all back over the desert that he had worked so hard to gain. And interestingly enough, it was right after he died. And his other two friends are sitting there just laughing at how much work and effort they went into to get the gold. Bogart dies. And in essence saying, you know what? I wasn't rich to begin with. I'm not rich now. Such is the way it ought to be. So here's the thing. These two men learned. They went on with their life. Bogart was so wrapped up in the gold itself that he forgot that life was important? Do we become so attached to the things of this world to the point to where we lose sight of what is vitally important, that we lose sight of the blessings that God has given us? That's the question. God, I think, through the book of Job, is trying to emphasize to us that the greater blessing is not the wealth, but it is wisdom. And so let's listen to what he says. Let's see what he's trying to say here. You can have a silver mine. You can have a gold mine. You can have iron taken from the earth, copper smelted from ore. Man is able to put an end to darkness, candles, oil in the lamps, having a light on all the time if necessary. And man searches every recess for ore in the darkness and the shadow of death. He goes into some places where he might look for gold or ore or some of these other things that we've just mentioned, digging deep into the ground, having to bolster up the ground, give it some sort of strength where it won't collapse on him. Doing all these things, he breaks down open a shaft away from people in places forgotten by feet. They hang far away from men. They swing to and fro. As from the earth, from it comes bread. But underneath it's turned up as by fire. So again, he's talking about a miner digging these things out. And sometimes think about the idea that you could have fire start in these mines, kill people. We, a lot of times, again, maybe we don't think so much about gold and silver as much as we do about oil, especially now as we're paying what we're paying at the gas pump. Think about it, it's turned up and they've tried to find those precious stones, sapphires, diamonds, right? Diamond mines. Think about the idea that a lot of times now there's slave labor in other countries. Young people, children, used to dig in mines, to dig out things that we use over here in the United States for our cars. And so many of the other things that we need, our computers, our iPads, our telephones. He says, it contains gold dust, that path no bird knows, going down there into the ground, digging it all up. It contains gold. The falcon's eyes have not seen it. The proud lions have not gone down into it. The fierce lion has not passed over it. What does man do? He overturns the mountains at the roots. He cuts out channels in the rocks. His eye sees every precious thing. He dams up the streams from trickling, and what is hidden he brings forth to light. Again, thinking of the movie that I was just referencing, the idea of the sluice boxes where you have water running down and there's wood there, and the water is supposed to wash away the dirt and the debris, but all that should be left, because gold is heavier, is the gold. And you're looking for it. And a lot of times it's nothing more than just, seriously, all that's there is gold flakes. You can go to Delaga, Georgia, and actually go into some of these gold mines and actually mine a little bit of gold, as it was. But all it's going to be is gold flakes. He says this is what they do. And he brings forth these things to light. Men will work so hard to gain things in this life, and they wind up missing the important things, the eternal things, the things that you can't buy: love, peace, joy, the fruits of the Spirit. So he asked the question. Now, this is what they were doing. You see men digging and working and laboring hard for all of these things. Now he says this, where can wisdom be found? Do we dig for wisdom like we dig for everything else? Where's the place of understanding? He says, you know what, in all of this, he said, I just want you to understand that in all of this, as you look at it and as you continue to study it, all the gold, all the copper, all the silver, all the iron, or, everything else that's there, all the way man uses an ingenuity to get to that stuff, to get it to where it can happen in that respect. He says, what do you get out of it? The thing is that all these things are there. We work very hard for wealth just to give it to somebody else when we're dead. So he works hard to do all of that. He's turning over the mountains, literally, by the roots. He cuts out the rivers. And then he just asks the question. And it's an abrupt change, yes. What is wisdom? There was one guy that said that wisdom is the reason with which we deal with principles. All right, where do you find wisdom? The proverb writer will commend the people for their wisdom. But all through the book of Proverbs, you will also find descriptions of fools time after time after time. Wisdom is not being clever. It's not being ingenious. Wisdom causes us to take a few minutes to study it, to understand its cause, the purpose. And again, wisdom causes us to seek to solve the riddles of the universe. And again, think about the idea that we've really come a long way. The fact that we're talking on a computer to one another. And a lot of times as we do that, we don't even have to be in the same room, but we can communicate with one another. Telephone, so forth. So what is it? Well, here he's going to emphasize the idea that the fear of the Lord, verse 28 is what he's going to say. He says, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And to depart from evil is understanding. So as Job continues this, you can get all the gold, the silver, and everything else, but what you really need is wisdom. Wisdom. Where can wisdom be found? Where is the place of understanding? Man does not know its value, nor is it found in the land of the living. So again, you can't really find it like you would looking for ore, like you would finding gold. Proverbs 16:16, it's better to get wisdom than what? Gold. Proverbs 4:7, wisdom is the principal thing, says Solomon. Job 12, again, the three friends thought it was dwelt with them. They thought that they had the wisdom. Job 12, verse 2. But later, God's going to reproach them for their folly in Job chapter 42 at verse 8. And again, where's the place of understanding, the place of wisdom? So the wisdom is that which deals with principles. Understanding is how you apply it and appreciate these things. So think about the idea that it's much simpler and easier to understand wisdom and so forth. So what does he say? Man doesn't know the value of wisdom. We really don't. If we knew the value of wisdom, if we knew how to really use wisdom to our advantage, there would be no more wars. There would be no more pain. There would be no more suffering and heartache and so forth that we bring on ourselves because of our own sins. So he's really coming down hard on him and trying to emphasize to all of us that wisdom is the most important thing. True wisdom, again, does not exist among men. It's above human faculties. And what did he say earlier that it boils down to? It boils down to doing what God says. The fear of the Lord is wisdom. So that's what it all boils down to. Man does not know the value of wisdom. We want our children to be wise. We want our children to have everything that they can have and do everything that they can do. But again, the greatest thing we can give them is learning how to be wise. And again, understanding that you can't just get it except by what? Living through and making the mistakes that you make. Think about the idea that God's ways are past finding out. We study, we memorize, we come to grips with the Bible. I commend all of you that are taking this class because you are wanting to know more and more and more of God's will, and I appreciate that. But as long as you study the Bible, you're always going to come up with more insights, more wisdom, more understanding. And that's what this is all about. That's what we need to be doing constantly. So what does he say? He says, listen, the deep, what does the deep say? The deep said, it's not in me. You can go to the deepest part of the ocean, the Mariana Trench. And if there's a way to talk to that part of the ocean, you could say, is wisdom down here? It's not down here. It's not down here. And again, think about how wide the oceans are, the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans, and think about how in these situations they're so wide. Well, if it's the lowest part of the earth? No. Is it as wide as the ocean? Yeah, but again, that doesn't even begin to touch it, does it? You can't buy wisdom. No amount of gold can purchase it, is what he says. It cannot be purchased for gold, nor can silver be weighed for its price. The idea of this is that if gold can't purchase it, silver's not going to be able to purchase it. There's no way. It's not something that you can buy from God. I need a bunch more wisdom. Well, how much? Well, as much as I can get. You don't have enough money. There's no way you could buy that from God. A lot of times they'll talk about weighing silver, weighing gold in a scale, and you put wisdom in one thing and you've got this and the other, and over and over again. If gold can't purchase it, then silver can't purchase it. The bottom line is silver can't do it. Gold nor crystal can equal it, is what he's emphasizing there. Verse 15, it cannot be purchased for gold, silver. It cannot be valued in the gold of Ophir. Again, what's he doing in verse 16? There's that parallelism again. This gold of Ophir all through the Bible is, without a doubt, probably some of the purest gold that ever was. The problem is there are not a lot of folks today that really know where that is. A lot of people believe it may have been in Arabia somewhere. Okay, well, Arabia is a pretty big land. So think about the idea that they may have had great gold there, but now where is it? Where is it? Where do you find it? As we are going through this period of a recession or a downturn, or values are so high, everybody's telling us to buy gold so that we what? So we'll have again a hedge against everything that's out there. So he says, think on gold a little bit this. He says, it cannot be valued in the gold of Ophir. Wisdom cannot be valued in the gold of Ophir. It can't be bought by precious onyx or sapphire. Neither gold nor crystal can annul it, or can equal wisdom. So you have all these different, beautiful, wonderful stones that if I were to go down to a jewelry store and buy, they would cost me lots of money. But you can't go anywhere to buy wisdom. Again, it can't be bought that way. And I think there's so many folks today that would love to do that. He says, going on, neither gold nor crystal, nor can it be exchanged for jewelry of fine gold. No mention shall be made of quartz or coral. The idea is that, things that are high, pearls, things along that line. The price of wisdom is far above rubies. The topaz of Ethiopia cannot equal it, nor can it be valued in pure gold. Oh, how we wish we could buy it. Oh, how we wish we could learn it without having to learn it the hard way. And yet that's how we gain it. That's how we obtain it. That's how we're able to deal with it, is that hard way. So over in all through this poetic language, in this Hebrew parallelism, he's given us every kind of possibility that you could use to try to buy it, but he's just making the point, it can't be bought. Wisdom is something you gain from experience. It cannot be valued in pure gold. And so the thing he's trying to emphasize here, this is what we need, this wisdom. So verse 20, where does it come from? Now this goes back to chapter 28, verse 12. Where can wisdom be found? Where's the place of understanding? And he's given us all these things where you can't find it, or all these ways where we can't buy it. And now he says, where does it come from? Where's the place of understanding? I think, again, Job is repeating himself. Anytime the Bible repeats itself, he's trying to make a point that needs to be understood. He has tried to show some light on the subject, but again, where does wisdom come from? And we know not. It's hidden all from eyes of all living. So the thing is that, you can't see it because it's immaterial. You can't touch it. You can't buy it. You can't conceive of it. Nature transcends it. It is kept close to the fowls of the air. The birds can see the smallest thing. They can see a little bitty bug on the grass, or a worm that moves a little bit, and they'll come flying down and get it and eat it. But he said even birds cannot detect where wisdom is. And he says, we've heard this fame thereof with our ears. He goes on and he says, destruction and death say, we have heard a report of it with our ears. God understands its ways. The ideal is the inhabitants of Sheol, the inhabitants of the grave, the inhabitants of the afterworld, the world of the departed. And he says, they hear these things, they know of it, but where is the place where you gain wisdom? Not there. So what's he trying to do? He's saying the birds don't know where it is. We don't know where it is. Destruction doesn't know where it is. Death does not know where it is. But God understands its way. Only God understands what true wisdom is. It is a part of his being. It is a part of who he is. It's an essential element of his nature. He knows the way of it. He knows how wisdom works. He knows how wisdom manifests itself. He knows how the place of it, where it dwells. He knows the limits that it has. He knows how far it's able to be communicated, and he knows so all of these things, but we don't. We don't. He knows his place. He looks to the ends of the earth, and he sees under the whole heavens. Now, again, here we have this wonderful, beautiful picture of God's omnipresence, God's omniscience, God knowing everything, as well as what we know. And we know we don't know everything. In fact, the older it seems like we get, the more we found out that we know what we don't know. In other words, I know that I don't know so much more of this world. You could have the wisest, smartest man on the universe that's able to tell you everything in the world about chemistry and all these other doctrines and fields that we have, but he still can't tell you how the earth got here. He can't tell you how God saved us through Jesus Christ unless he himself is a Christian. Man has conditions. We can only go so far and do so much over the course of a day. God does not have any conditions. There's nothing limiting God. God's knowledge, man's knowledge is strict and has very narrow limits. And again, whenever I was going to school and so forth, I learned English. I learned how to write. I learned math. It was one of my favorite subjects. I learned sociology. I learned so many different things. I tried to be as broad a person as I could, learn more. I got into Bible college. I thought I knew the Bible. Finally came to find out I didn't know the Bible like I thought I did. Went and got my bachelor's degree, was preaching for years, decided that, you know what, I need to further my studies. Went back, got my master's degree in Bible. And as I was studying it again, under the tutelage of some teachers, I learned even that much more and that much more and that much more. I guess what we're trying to say is that no matter what we learn, there's always so much more to learn. And that's truly the case when it comes to wisdom. It truly is the case where, again, we can understand it. And again, here's the thing, with God, there are no limits. With us, there are things that we cannot even begin to comprehend. God, he looks to the end of the earth. He knows where wisdom is. It is a part of who he is. He also knows our limits. God knows everything that goes on under the sun. His knowledge of earthly things is unlimited. And his knowledge of heavenly things, unlimited. He knows about the sun, the moon, and stars. We talked last week about the thunderstorms and how they carry so much water. And then all of a sudden it bursts, as it was, and rain comes and it just continues to fall and fall and fall and fall and fall. And you think about the idea that we don't know about all the comets, the planets, the nebulae, the ends, the laws. We don't know everything about mathematical law. We don't understand about all these things. God knows it all. And that's why the psalmist was saying in Psalms 139 and verse 6, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. I cannot attain to it. And so we don't. We don't. And what does he do? Going on a little further in chapter 28 and verse 25, he says what? He looks to the end of the earth. He sees under the whole heaven. He understands it all. He established the weight for the wind. Think about, in this small passage here, he's talking about the barometric pressure, the idea of what does air weigh. Now, of course, most of us would not even think about what does air weigh, but it does weigh. It weighs down on us. It's part of the gravity. It keeps us, helps us to stay on earth, etc. In Isaiah 40, verse 12, he said, who has measured the water in the hollow of his hand and meted out heaven with a span? Have we ever counted every particle of dust in the earth? Can you weigh the mountains with a scale? No. Everything in creation is proportioned for everything else in creation for us to live in this. Only God knows that. And again, these words should be words of encouragement to us because our God knows this, he understands this, and this helps us to understand what we need to be doing. So, and furthermore, it helps us to have faith in him. Chapter 28, verse 26, going a little further. He says, he looks to the end of the earth, he sees the whole heaven, to establish a weight for the wind, to apportion the waters by measure. He made a law for the rain. Again, as I was studying this today, we had some storms come through the Atlanta area. We probably got 3 to 4 inches of rain in the course of 3 or 4 hours. I mean, it was just raining so hard. It would just, and again, last week I mentioned the idea of how does the rain stay up in the sky? How does it do that? And again, we know the water cycle. We know we've been taught this stuff. We know the water droplets and so forth. But the thing is that you know what? He placed rain under fixed and unalterable laws. They follow the laws. Rainy seasons in some countries begin on a fixed day on the calendar, and they look forward to it because they're looking for the rain. Think about the way of lightning and thunder. We heard, as I said today, thunderstorms, so there was lightning. And again, God's law gave us the electric current. We're able to see, we're able to give computers to help us to do what we're doing right now because we have been blessed with figuring out how many of these things work. But again, think about the idea that we still don't know. We still don't have all the answers to every question that man has about God's creation and what he's done for us. He knows the exact way lightning goes and falls from the sky to the earth. And of course, we know in our minds that it's not that the lightning is falling from the sky as much as there's the atoms in the atmosphere are so bent one way, either negative or positively, that whenever you have a great number of positive in the sky and the negative down at the bottom where it could ground itself out, that's the path that the lightning is going to come from. I was on one occasion working outside when the storm was coming through. I was sitting on the ground and lightning hit. It didn't actually hit me. I'm still here, right? But it hit and came through the ground, and it felt like it blew my right foot off. I could not walk with my leg for 4 or 5 hours. Every nerve had been fired off in that leg at that moment in time. It made me a believer at that point in time. I used to think, oh, I'm a man, and lightning's not going to hit me, but it hit me. And I'm grateful that I didn't catch the whole blast of it. If I did, I wouldn't be here to talk with you about this right now. This man right here has a great deal of respect for lightning. I have a huge respect for how God put all that together. Events in my life has helped me to have an even greater faith and appreciation for what God does. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to teach this book of Job, because I remembered some of these things. That and the fact that, again, I've shared with you before that I've lost my son earlier this year. And I wanted to see how Job dealt with that issue. And now, much of what I had studied before years ago, 20, 30 years ago, and taught 2 or 3 times, now has even greater meaning to me. It takes things like this for us to understand. Everything is ruled by God's infinite, marvelous, majestic wisdom. And he says in verse 27, he saw wisdom. Again, if you look in that, he said he saw wisdom. And what did he say? And he declared it. He prepared it. He searched it out. It's not like God was not wise and he's trying to figure it out on his own. No, 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 no. God made it, the Bible says. He declared it, he prepared it, and he gives it to us. Sometimes we do not like the way we have to learn some things. I could tell stories about my life as an elder, as a preacher, mistakes I've made. Sometimes in my mind, they're very vivid, like they happened yesterday. Mishandling certain things in the church that hurt the church in the long run. Sometimes as I look at these things, as I've said before, I pray to God constantly that he would forgive me for these things. I know that he has. But it's something to think about. We need God's wisdom. We need God's understanding. And so he said, here it is. Here's the key. This is a passage that we need to memorize. More than just memorizing this passage, it is a passage that tells us how we gain it. The fear of the Lord. That is wisdom. You know, true wisdom is the fear of God. True wisdom is understanding how God feels about sin. True wisdom is saying, in essence, I want nothing to do with sin because it is so contrary to the God that I serve. I don't want anything to do with sin because it cost God his only begotten Son to save me. No amount of intelligence, no amount of cleverness, no amount of information, knowledge, no amount of worldly or scientific wisdom can avail me any help if I don't build upon the foundation that God has given me in Jesus Christ. We need to understand that God is all wise. God has given us everything. And what's he saying to us? You have the proper respect, the proper fear, the proper honor of God. That is wisdom. Now, let's talk about the word fear. Again, some people think that it's talking about the ideal of honor, and that's that. But it also suggests the ideal of a fear of disappointing God. It is that fear sometimes that motivates us to not engage in sin. The greatest motive should always be our love for the Lord and our love for his commandments and love for his laws. But it also is a motive in a sense that I don't want to disappoint him. I certainly don't want to be cut off from him through eternity. I want to be in the right relationship with him. So there needs to be that healthy respect for God's law, healthy respect for God because he gave us that law, that he did not leave us ignorant, that he sent his son to die on the cross so that we might have salvation from our sins. And if God was willing to pay that price, then I need the least I can do is to honor him by departing from evil, by not wanting any sin in my life, not flirting with it, not looking at it, not listening to it, truly departing from evil. The fear of the Lord is wisdom. To depart from evil is understanding. Let's take a break for a few minutes and we'll pick back up about 8 o'clock and we'll go from there. Okay, we've just discussed the ideal of wisdom and how important wisdom is. We've looked at it from the viewpoint of what God had said and how we need to make sure that we are having that proper respect, that fear of the Lord that we need to have. So we're going a little bit further in chapter 29. He continues, the Bible says, as he did in chapter 27, verse 1. He continues again in chapter 29, verse 1. He continued his discourse. And now what we're beginning to find as we go through the book specifically is that he continues his whole thing. And he says, you know what? I wish it was the way it was. I wish, or oh, that I were as in months past, in the days when God watched over me. He felt like that God has pretty well betrayed him. He feels like that God has turned away from him and is no longer there to help him with all the things he's struggling with. Uh, by this time, Job, we don't know how long this particular disease lasted. We don't know how long this testing took place, but probably, especially if you've been through so much, 1 minute is too long. 1 minute just goes on and on and on. Sometimes it just seems like that the past was so much long ago. As we get older, we know and have the ideal in our minds and in our hearts, the fact that it just didn't seem like it was that long ago that I was a teenager, that I was doing what I was doing. And it didn't seem like it was that long ago that I began to preach. And as time goes on, it seems like time goes faster. And so the thing is, he says, Job is saying here, he said, I wished it was like it was. And he says, he's looking at it like it's something that happened so many years ago. And he just feels like he can't go, he can't go on any further. As in the days, he said, when God preserved me, that when God watched over me, he never forgot that God is the one who gave him the prosperity. He never forgot to thank God for all of that. And again, we look in Job chapter 1 and also Job chapter 2, that he would thank God time and again for the blessings that he had, even when he was struggling with his hurt and his pain. For example, Job chapter 10, verses 8 through 12, where he says, your hands fashioned and made me, and now you destroyed me altogether. You have made me like clay, and will you return me to the dust? Will you not pour me out like milk, or did you not pour me out like milk and curdle me like cheese? You clothed me with skin and flesh and knit me. You granted me life and steadfast love. You've granted, did you hear that? Life and steadfast love. Steadfast love in the English Standard Version, a lot of times is a word that's used to talk about mercy. And he says, your care has preserved my spirit. So the thing is look at, this is the way Job was. And he says, I'm going to bless God's name no matter what. He goes on in verse 3 and he says, what? When his lamp shone upon my head and when by light I walked through darkness. He says, just as I was in the days of my prime, when the friendly counsel of God was over me, and when the Almighty was yet with me, when my children were around me, with my steps were bathed with cream, and the rock poured out rivers of oil for me. As Job is coming to his defense, he remembers. And that's what we often do. The Lord, you're there with me, and I know you're there, and I know you take care of me, and I know you bless me, and you all do all this respect. The idea of a light, a lamp, suggests the idea of prosperity in life. And God, I remember whenever you were there and we were friends, and we spent time together. He said, you've blessed me. You lit my candle. And a lot of times the blessings would suggest the idea of how God lighted candles, giving them light. Think about the idea of being blessed is having the light to do the right thing. And so over and over again, he says, you know what? You have shown your countenance upon me. There is no darkness with God. One of the things about heaven, and I'm not sure exactly how all that's going to work out. We all go to bed at night and we all get some rest, our physical bodies. But whenever we're there in our spiritual bodies, we're not going to need any rest. We're not going to need all the things that we think we need. And he says, you know what? God is going to continue to bless us and give us all of these things. And so the thing is that when God withdraws his light, when he withdraws those blessings, then it seems like that's when we see his impact on our lives more than ever. It's easy to rejoice in God to praise God and glorify God whenever he's blessing us in so many ways. It's hard. When the world comes in and we don't know which way we're going to turn, when we lose loved ones, when we lose jobs, when we lose our health, it's hard to keep walking through those dark times. We need God's light. We need God. And that's the part of the thing that I think he's trying to really emphasize to us all, is the fact that that's what we need. And that's what Job was rejoicing in. He says, in the days of my, as we go back at it, just as I was in the days of my prime, the days of my youth, the ideal of the days of his ripeness, the days of full manhood, when, he reached his, everything that he had before all of these calamities fell upon him. He said, the secret of God, the friendly counsel of God was over my tent. The idea is that God was, when I was in a sweet relationship with God, I'd talk with him and he would commune with me. And again, we spent time together. For the child of God, that's the thing we want. I look forward to worship, not just so I can meet and worship with my brethren, but I know God's there. I know God is there listening to me. And sometimes I sing loud. Yeah, I want to, because I want him to hear. And I know he can hear me anyway. And I'm praying my heart out. And I'm preaching. And one thing that I do a lot is obsess a lot about my sermons. I want them to be perfect, but I have yet to preach the perfect sermon. The ideal is that as I'm looking through this and struggling with all of this, I just want that sweet relationship with him that he wants to have with me. The older I get, the more I study scripture, the more I understand that what I fill my mind with will impact my relationship with God. So I've gotten to the point where I'm very, very careful as to what I watch, what I listen to. Some songs that I used to think was the coolest songs in the world, I don't listen to anymore because they're encouraging things that are ungodly. The closer we get to God, the closer communion we have with him, the more we want to serve him, the more we want to honor him, the more we want to praise his name. And he says, going on in verse 5, he says, the Almighty was yet with me. My children were around me. These are sad words, because Job feels like that God has forsaken him in his afflictions. And he looks at it from the viewpoint that God is no longer with him, no longer on his side, but instead is his enemy. And again, what he struggled so much about was the idea of, God, what have I done to cause this? If you're going to attack me, then why am I suffering this way? Back in Job chapter 6, he will say, the arrows of the Almighty are within me. So God has purposefully done these things to me. He said in Luke or Job 7:19, how long will you not look away from me or leave me alone until I swallow my spit? And then Job 9:17, he says, he crushes me with a tempest and multiplies my wounds without cause. And then he said, when my children were about me. Oh, we love our children. We care for them so very, very much. We're grateful for the fact that God gave these children to us. And he says, I just want to have that relationship with them again. And he says, I washed, my steps were bathed with cream. The King James says, my steps were washed with butter. There was that ideal of fatness, the ideal of joy and deliciousness and gladsome. The ideal that he's looking at is the cream of everything. the best of the flocks, the best of the crops, the best of the milk, the best of everything. He said, that's what I had so much butter. I was so blessed that I'm just washing my steps with butter because God has blessed me so much. Think about the idea of he was brought with so much oil that it seemed like to him the rocks flowed with rivers of it. And he says, he said the rocks poured out rivers of oil for me. And I went out to the gate of the city. And I took my seat in the open square. The idea, this is where usually business was conducted. Go back and read some of the other passages. Look especially at the idea of the book of Ruth, very small book. But it emphasized the idea that Ruth was trying to get Boaz to marry her as the redeemer in that family. We remember that whole story there of how she was seeking his help. And you remember the rest of the story, how Boaz and Ruth had a son, and he was in the lineage of Jesus, in the lineage of David. Think about the idea on numerous occasions where people would make agreements. And a lot of times reading through scripture, you read of these events where they would make these contracts to sell land, to buy property, to do all these other things. It was at this large place that a lot of these people would do that. All the people would gather together as one man into the square before the water gate. And here they told Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses that the Lord had sent unto them in Nehemiah chapter 8 at verse 1. So probably Job had served as judge and maybe as an administrator. He would prepare his seat in the street. And again, he was brought out and prepared to hear cases and deliver sentences according to what he knew to be right or to be wrong. He says, I went out to the gate of the city. I took my seat and the young men saw me and hid. Why? He was their superior. The aged arose and would stand up. And he said, the respect was paid to me, not because of age, but my dignity. Everybody knew me. Even those that were my age and older knew that God had blessed me. He says the princes refrained from talking and put their hands on their mouths. And they had enough dignity to let this older man speak and say what needs to be said. Sometimes maybe we can't even understand that because we've lost respect in this country for older people. We don't listen to what they've gone through. And one of the things that I thank God for is the fact that sometimes I've had the opportunity to sit down and listen to people that lived through the Depression, that lived through World War II, that were in World War II. My dad was in the Korean War as well as the Vietnam War, and I heard a lot of what he had to say there. Men that learned the hard way. Men that were men. And he says, they laid their hand on their mouths. They held their tongue. They had such respect for Job. He said the nobles, verse 10, the voice of nobles was hushed and their tongue stuck to the roof of the mouth. They didn't say anything. Again, it's kind of a repetition. The idea is they said nothing. They listened to every word, hung on every word that Job had to say. And when the ear heard me, he said it blessed me when they heard what I had to say. And then when the eyes saw, they approved me. The idea is the chief men, the common people, everybody was respectful to who he was. And nobody would dare challenge him with any sin because of the righteousness and because of the way he lived his life, because of the help that he would give to other people, because of his honor of God. People respected him. And again, think about those that he'd helped. Don't you know that whenever he would walk into the city, those people that he had helped on time after time after time, don't you know that they would fall down and worship him and honor him for all the things he had done for them, all the blessings? They also knew that whenever Job was there as their judge, they'd get a fair hearing. They didn't have to worry about buying a judge off or something like that. They knew that they would get a just judgment. That's the kind of man Job was. The eye of the poor man lighted up because he knew that Job was a man of candor and integrity. He says in verse 12, I delivered the poor who cried out. I want to remind you that Job's friends accused him of not taking care of the widows and the poor people. And Job is saying, yes, I did. I most certainly did. No way in this world. He oppressed no widow. He did not injure any child. He did not hurt anybody in any way. The Bible says again that he was the richest man in the East. God had such blessed him because he was a godly man. And he says, you know what? He says, I delivered the poor, the fatherless, the one who had no helper. The blessing of a perishing man came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. Sometimes, from what we read in history as well as the Bible, oppression in the East sometimes drove its victims to suicide because they starved to death. In Isaiah 1, Isaiah condemned the people of Isaiah's day because of their failure to take care of those that were hungry. A lot of times in the church, and I'll make this statement, you may disagree with me, and that's fine, but a lot of times in the church, we will use the passage that emphasizes the idea that if any will not work, neither let him eat. But I want to remind you, and I may have already said this before, but I want to remind you that that is written to the church. And the bottom line is what he's trying to emphasize is that those of us that are members of the Lord's church need to get out and get the jobs so that we might be able to feed and help others. That's what God wants us to do with our blessings. Think about the idea. Job was not content with just refraining from evil, but he worked hard at helping people in every way that he could. And their affliction was turned to rejoicing. Their lamentation turned to happiness. They were able to know that God was there through the means of Job and what Job was doing. And we must, again, remember the same thing. Job 29:14, I put on righteousness. It clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a turban. I was eyes to the blind, feet to the lame, father to the poor. I searched out the case that I did not know. I broke the fangs of the wicked and plucked the victim from his teeth. Let's go through some of the things he just said. I put on righteousness and it clothed me. He kind of talked about it like a garment. It's kind of like when I got up in the morning and got dressed, I dressed in righteousness. I was doing right deeds. And so he clothed himself and he covered it all up with his natural imperfections and made it a part of him, that people would know that there goes a righteous man, a man that is doing what God wants him to do. What is righteousness? Is right living. Well, how do I know a righteous man and right living? The only way we can know is through Scripture. Again, we've already referenced that when he talked about what wisdom was. And he emphasized again the idea that the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. So whenever we walk according to the fear of the Lord, when we depart from evil, then we will, our money, our time, our efforts, everything will be controlled by that. So he put on righteousness, and it was a beautiful cloth to him. And so as he put it on, it was not something that was just external, but he also put it on internal. I'm a righteous man. And that's what Job has been arguing all along. I'm a righteous man. I haven't done anything wrong. I haven't done anything to deserve this. You three have come to condemn me, but that's not what's going on here. And he says, my judgment, my justice, my robe, my crown. So he says, I was eyes to the blind, giving them the information that they needed to help them on their way. He was feet to the lame, taking messages for them, going on their errands, kind and helpful to his fellow man, not only in great but little matters, the little bitty things that a lot of times many of us don't think about. He was a father to the poor. And he says, I gave their causes to possible attention. I searched them out. I investigated them. I diligently, as if it was the causes of my own friend, I will do whatever I can to help. And he says, I broke the fangs of the wicked. Some people think that Job may have been the executioner of the wicked, but I don't necessarily believe that has to be the case. What he did is, in essence, was, he's keeping these wicked people from preying upon the others. Or maybe he is compelling these people that have stolen from these poor people, made them pay it back. So he says, I said, I shall die in my nest and multiply my days as the sand. Years ago, whenever I was in college, I was having some problems, and I went and talked to one of my professors that I had a lot of respect for. And he listened to me for a little while, and I appreciated the fact that he did so. And he commiserated with me and told me, some advice. And he did remind me of something that I've never thought of, but that we don't like it when we get our nest messed up, And I think that's what he's saying. The nest is where family is. It's where we live, breathe, move. Everything that we know, everything about us in one way or another is being at the nest, you know what I'm saying? And so he's emphasizing this idea to us that I'm going to die in my nest, but it didn't happen that way. Some commentators think he's talking about like the phoenix that burns up every 50 years and then comes back again. I don't know that that's the case, but there seems to be some people that believe that this is referencing that. He said, my roots were spread out by the waters. I gained everything I needed from the waters, and it helped me. Again, they nourished me. The dew lay all night upon my branch. And so he's saying that God has blessed me in all of these things, and it's reached my roots, and it's brought me up through there. And again, I've just been richly blessed and refreshed. Verse 20, my glory is fresh within me. My bow is renewed in my hand. My strength did not fail. When it seemed like he was at the point of failing, it was secretly renewed. Think about sometimes how God has helped us in that same respect, given us the need or given us what we need at the moment in time when we need it the most. He said, verse 21, men listened to me and waited. He had the respect of people at the gates. We already talked about that. But he had the respect of people, everybody that knew him or saw him knew him. And he says, my speech settled on them like the dew. They listened. They heard my advice. They were challenged by what I said. And after I said these words, verse 22, they did not speak again. the debate ended because they felt like the best thing that needed to be said was said by Job. My speech dropped upon them. He was a wise man, gave wise counsel. And so as you look at all of that together, it's just a beautiful, beautiful passage suggesting how they were. He said, they waited for me. They waited for me like for the rain. And again, at that time of year, think about it, in that culture at that time, there were times of the year when they didn't get a drop of rain. This is the reason why, as you read through the Old Testament, you'll see that many, many times that the children of Israel suffered drought, famine as a result of it. And a lot of those times it suggested that God gave that. And again, whenever you think about 7 years without rain, without water, that's when it gets really tough. You can't plant gardens. You can't do what you need to do to continue to subsist. And he's saying here, think about how important rain is. Again, we get sick of it whenever there's too much of it, but if it weren't for rain, there would be no crops. There would be nothing to eat. And again, the ground absorbing, especially the ground that has been drought ridden. He says, they drank what I said, like you drink in the spring showers, whenever everything tastes so good, the latter rains. And he says, verse 24, if I mocked at them, they did not believe it. In the light of my countenance, they did not cast down. In other words, I smiled on them, and they didn't think that it was condescension on my part, that I was so good that they, just because I smiled at them, they felt better. No. He says, they never put me out of confidence or countenance. They made me sad or gloomy by opposing my views. He said, I chose out their way and sat chief. They came to me for advice. I gave it to them. A lot of folks go to people for advice. The tragedy is that if we go to people for advice and don't listen to it, and again, we've got to be very careful because some advice is not the best advice. He says, I chose the way for them. I counseled them the best way to go in the circumstances that they were going with. So not only was Job a wealthy man, not only was he a wise man, and again, the wealth and the wisdom may have come together in that respect because God blessed him so much. But I challenge you to think about the idea that everybody looked at him and he's saying, that's the way it is. And now everybody's scorning me because of what's going on. Everybody would come to me for comfort, for advice, for help, for guidance, whenever they needed it the most. And I was like one who comforts mourners, who gives them hope somewhere down the line. And this is what was sad about it all, is that whenever all this happened, after all this happened, he was then gone. Nobody would listen to him. Nobody would listen to what he had to say anymore because of all he's going through. So here he was, rich, honored, blessed with children, flourishing in favor with God and man. And now, beginning in chapter 30, what does he say? This is the way I was. And now men despise me. God afflicts me. I'm in terror, tortured with bodily pain, cast off by God. Nothing but death to look for. Chapter 30 may very well be the most touching chapter, especially after what we read in chapter 29, because here he goes from riches, health, honor, prestige, to misery, pain, heartache, and struggles. And so, as we begin to read through this, we see from riches to rags, from prestige and honor to disregard. All of these things come into play. So let's take just about a couple of minute break. Let me wet my whistle and then I'll pick right back up. All right. We've talked about the idea of how he was. Now, everything that we've looked at in chapter 29 is totally different in chapter 30. He says, chapter 30, verse 1, and as you start looking at this, verses 1 through 10, he talks about right now how despised, or how he is despised of men. Men despise him. Verses 1 through 10. He feels like he's afflicted from God. Verse 11. He is struggling with terrors. Verse 15. Tortured with pain in his body. And we've seen this all the way through the book up to this point in time, but specifically mentioned in 17 and 18. Verses 19 and 20 talks about the fact that he was cast off by God and nothing but death to look forward to. It is a riches to rags story. Honor to dishonor. Praise to mockery. It's a sad story of how far a man can fall. Now they mock at me, men younger than I, whose fathers I disdain to put with the dogs of my flock. What profit is the strength of their hands to me? Their vigor has perished. They're gaunt from want and famine, fleeing late to the wilderness, desolate and waste, who pluck mallow by the bushes and broom tree roots for their food. They were driven out from among men. They shouted at them as at a thief. They had to live in the clefts of the valleys, in the caves of the earth and the rocks. Among the bushes they brayed. Under the nettles they nestled. They were sons of fools, sons of vile men. They were scourged from the land. So as he talks about the honor that he once had, he now begins his contrast by telling us how he is disgraced, derided. Men that were outcasts and solitary, poor dwellers in caves, they didn't have much to keep their body together, their soul together. Young people, older people, doesn't make a difference. They spare, they don't even care. They'd spit in his face. And again, think about how all these people didn't show any respect for them in whatsoever. He says, I would not have thought about hiring their fathers to serve with my dogs as a sheep herder. He puts them on a par as sheepdogs. And he says, these men, they mock at me. He said, I would not have even given their fathers any thought because of the way they were. What about he says, what profit is the strength of their hands to me? Men who had no strength in their hands to yield an employer any profit. He says, they perished. And he says, they mocked me. They couldn't help me out. Their vigor has perished. So you've got these people that I would not have hired mocking me, or their sons are mocking me because of what's going on here. Whenever we're hurting, whenever we're really struggling with things that's going on in our lives we have no control over, we have a tendency to exaggerate just how bad it is, perhaps to get sympathy, but I think also because that's how we feel. We just feel like everything and everyone is against us at that moment in time. And that's the reason why we've got to think about the idea that Job is suffering, he's hurting, and so now perhaps he has overblown some of this to the point to where he's just is cursing everybody because of what he's going through. And so, whenever we struggle that way, It makes life hard for others. It makes life hard for us. We always have a tendency at that point in time to look at the very worst in people. When I'm not getting along with my brother or sister in Christ, when I'm not getting along with family members or whatever reason, we think the whole world's against us. He says, in verse 3, he says, they were gaunt or are gaunt from want and famine, fleeing to the wilderness, desolate and waste. He said, you know what? They're feeding on dry and roots and stuff like that. They're about to starve to death. And he said, these people are the ones that's mocking me now. These children are the ones that I would not have had working in my farm. These are mocking me. And he says they pluck mallow at this particular passage, emphasizing a plant that was part of the salty marshes. That a lot of times these people that could not afford to buy anything else, they would be eating these plants, kind of like a shrub. But the leaves are sour to the taste, the flowers are purple, and it grow again is something to eat. And they would eat juniper roots for their meat. And again, think about the idea that when they didn't have meat to eat, they were very poor, they couldn't do it, they would be eating tree roots just to be able to live. The sheep would eat this food, cows sometimes whenever they needed to, because it did yield some nourishment, but that was about it. They were driven out from among men. They shouted at them as at a thief. Whenever these people were running away, they didn't dare dispute. They just got drove out. The stronger races or the stronger people would gladly make them their slaves. But whenever they were outcast, then they became robber tribes. All they did would be the marauders, you might say. They don't have any land to build or to make food with. They're driven into rocky deserts. Want makes them thieves, marauders, and they're going to attack anybody that comes down their way. Picture again, if you choose to, and watch the picture again. So maybe some of the westerns that was done back in the 1950s and the 1960s that you can watch on television, and that there would always be gangs that would be robbing cattle, robbing wagon trains, robbing this, robbing that, because they were just marauders. And he said, this is where they're driven from among men. Nobody wants to have anything to do with them. And he says, as he's going to go on here, he says, people that I would have nobody or nothing to do with because of the way they were. They would dwell in the cliffs and the valleys. And again, think about that. Caves of the earth, in the rocks. That's where they would live because they couldn't afford anything else. And he says, among the bushes, notice verse 7, they brayed. Whenever you look at that word braid, it suggests the idea of a donkey making its noise. And the noise that's come from their mouth sounded like the braying of a donkey. Their language is unlike any other people. Sometimes we get around some people and we kind of dismiss them because of the way they talk. Sometimes we dismiss them because of the things they say. And why? We talk and we speak according to our level of intelligence, our level of education, our level of experience. There are those that may not have had gone through schools and been educated very well, but because they've lived life, they have some of the best advice in the world. And again, these people were living hand to mouth, doing the best they can. He says in verse 8, they were sons of fools, vile men. They were scourged from the land. Okay, they had no name. The race had never made itself any name. They were unknown, insignificant, viler than the earth. And so he's just, again, making this repetition again over and over and over. And he says they were children. This is where they were. He says, now. I am their song. Now, the ones that I dismissed, was just dismissed, they dismiss me. In Job 17, verse 6, he said, he's made me a byword of the peoples, and I am one before whom men spit. They despise me now. They despise me. I am their toning song. I am their byword. They flee far from me. They're aloof from me. They spit in my face. Again, a lot of times, some people think, well, maybe they didn't actually spit in Job's face, and that's possible. And maybe we should take it that way. Other people think that, and again, thinking about it from that viewpoint, they would show despise, or they would show that they despise the other person. They didn't necessarily have to spit in their face, but they could just spit at them. So you see, that's where Job is. And that's where Job is struggling with. He says that he hath loosed my cord. Here's the reason why this is going on. He's loosed my bowstring and restricted me, and cast off restraint before me. He who? God. And again, Job turns here to some extent from his human persecutors to God. God has relaxed his fiber, taken away his strength, reduced Job to helplessness. And that's the only reason why these persecutors dare to come around me and insult me, because God's not with me to protect me anymore. God has inflicted me with blow after blow after blow, bereavement, pain, sores, and they let loose the bridle before me. That, this giving them the courage to lead him with insult after insult after insult, just rubbing salt into these wounds, not literally, but you know what I'm saying. There is the emotional side. There is the physical side. He said, upon my right hand rise the youth. He says, they push away my feet. He says that they raise against me their ways of destruction. They put obstacles in my way, impede my steps. Think about one of the worst things I ever did as I was growing up. I had a little sister. I was 9 years old at the time. I should have known better. She was a baby, and she was just learning to walk, and like a stupid idiot, I many times putting my foot in front of hers made her trip. I thought it was so funny. Dad saw me one time and slapped the fire out of me, which he should have done. As I read this, I was reminded of that. You don't take advantage of babies. You don't take advantage of older men, older women. But that's what they were doing with Job. They were causing him hurt. And they raised against him their way of destruction. He said, they break up my path. They promote my calamity. They have no helper. They come on as broad breakers under the ruinous storm. They roll along. Terrors are turning upon me. They pursue my honor as the wind, and my prosperity has passed like a cloud. See all the things he was going through? They interfere with everything that I try to do. They're profiting by my ruin. They're not helping me at all. They do all this, they dare all of that. Even though they have no powerful man to aid them, I'm just so weak that I can't fight back. It's like when water breaks through a dam. They just come at me and I can't stop it. It's like the sea that is turmoil because of a hurricane out in the ocean. And it comes back, and if you're not watching, it comes back with such force it can knock you down. And he says, these terrors are turned upon me. Now he's going from the human persecutors to the taming of his body. He's talking about these terrors that take hold of him, horrible dreams, horrible visions. Again, go back to Job chapter 7, verse 14. You scare me with dreams and terrify me with visions, he says. He says, Job 6, verse 4, that the terrors of God do set themselves in array against me. God is the one who seems to watch and tries him at every moment, seeking occasion against him, never leaving him an instant peace. He said, these terrors pursue my soul like the wind. They pursue my honor as the wind. And my prosperity has been like a cloud, not just my happiness, but my real welfare is gone. Body and soul are equally suffering, shaken with fears, disturbed with doubts, struggling with consequences and apprehensions, and I have nothing. I have nothing. And now my soul is poured out upon me. It's gone. I faint. The days of affliction take hold of me. And they possess me. I can't get loose. My bones are pierced in me at night. Again, this particular disease that he may have had is that one of the things that can happen is that some of the deeper bodily organs have a deep burning pain within them. So it's not just that, but the bones ache. And a lot of times they're greatest at night. They can't sleep. And then you have these dreams, feverish dreams, wild dreams. My gnawing pains never take a rest. And the thing is, I keep struggling. And he says, by great force, my garment is disfigured. Picture again the oozing that would come from this particular disease. It would get into his clothes, dry. So then, as he pulled these clothes off, some of the stuff may have stuck to the wound. As he would pull his clothes off to change, that would cause more pain as it started tearing the flesh. Think about how no one wanted to go around him because of the smell, no doubt. Think about how this clothing would stick to his body, and you know, sometimes he would maybe would lay there in a bath of some sort to just try to get the clothes off. In verse 19, he, God, has cast me into the mire, the lowest depth of misery and degradation I could ever have. And you know, I've become like dust and ashes. He feels like God has done this. God has done this. And he says, I cry to you, God, and you don't hear me. The worst part of what he had to deal with was he felt like God was not there. I appreciate Job sharing these things to us. His heart has been breaking. His health is gone. I cry to you and you don't hear me. What was the worst cry on the cross that Jesus made? Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? No good man is really forsaken by God. Job needed patience, maybe, as patient as he was. He says, "You've become cruel to me. With the strength of your hand, you oppose me. You lift me up to the wind and make me ride upon it. You spoil my success. For I know that you will bring me to death and to the house appointed for all the living." You and I used to have a relationship, God, but you've changed. He never has forgotten how God had been kind to him, fashioned him, made him all around, granted him life and favor. But as he was thinking about the relationship that he had with God, that also brings pain, because now he's suffering sorrow. God's not there, it seems like, anymore. Past joy is now present suffering. And he feels like, I can't go any further. I can't go any further. And he says in verse 23, I know, 22 and 23, I know you're going to bring me to death. You've lifted me up to the wind. I've been storm tossed like a piece of straw caught up in the air, thrown all over the place. You dissolve me entirely. And he says, I know that you're going to bring me to death into the house appointed for all the living. As far as Job was fit, as you're listening to it now, as far as Job was concerned, all he had left was death. That's it. And he kind of figures that it's not going to be much longer. His spirit has been broken. His heart has been broken. His body reminds him every day of pain, suffering. He's given up. I'm not going to get any better. And so you're going to bring me to death, and that's it. To the land of darkness and the shadow of death. Job 10, 21 and 22. He says, I shall go and not return to the land of darkness and deep shadow. No order, nothing. The thing that should encourage us is the idea of a resurrection. Death is not the end of the story. Death is the beginning of a new life. And I think that's something that should encourage all of us, especially whenever the world seems like it's caving in around us, especially when it seems like we can't ever figure out the best and the way to deal with things. If nothing else, I've referenced this before, but if nothing else, COVID has taught us that we're not in control of our destiny as we think we are. It's reminded us that we need God. It's also reminded us of the fact that Satan is going to use every opportunity that he can to destroy us, to break our spirit, to break our heart, to the point to where all we have left, like Job, is looking forward to death. But there still seems to be that thought, that idea, that perhaps, no, there is something beyond this life. We're going to stop there, and I'll pick up there tomorrow and continue this speech. Thank you.